Hello and welcome my channel. Lot your lost in the story. Close your eyes and drift off to sleep. First, subscribe to my channel, and if you're watching from another country, please the cowed, boys, the world truly lied. Truly Live, Chapter 1. The last free fire, the last. The world that built the cowboy long before the cowboy became a legend. He was simply a man doing a job no one else to do. The story of the American West is not one of romance born from thin air. It is story forged from dust. Cattle trails, open skies, and the raw necessity of survival in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. To understand how cowboys truly lived, you must first understand the world that created them. In motion. A continent being redrawn with every passing decade of the 19th century. In the years following the American Civil War, the United States fates itself transformed. The nation had survived its bloodiest conflict. And now, millions of men, many of them veterans, with nothing left to return to, drifted toward the Western territories in search of something, land, fortune, or simply a new beginning. The railroads were pushing westward with relentless energy, and the great cattle industry was expanding to meet the demands of a growing, hungry nation. It was at this intersection of need and opportunity that the American cowboy emerged. The cattle industry itself, birds, long before Anglo-American settlers arrived in large numbers. The Spanish had established ranching traditions across the Texas, New Mexico, and California. The vaqueros, the Spanish and Mexican horsemen who worked cattle on horseback, was the true original cowboy. His techniques, his vocabulary, and his tools were adopted wholesale by the men who came after him. The word lasso comes from the Spanish lazo. The word ranch comes from rancho. Even the word buckaroo, a term for a rough-riding cowboy, is likely a corruption of vaquero. The American cowboy did not invent himself. He inherited a tradition stretching back centuries to the cattle cultures of the Iberian Peninsula. After the Civil War, the Texas Longhorn became the foundation of a continental industry. These cattle, descended from Spanish stock and adapted to the harsh conditions of the Texas plains, could survive where other breeds could not. They were lean, tough. By some estimates, 5 million Longhorns roamed the ranges of Texas. By the mid-1860s, they were also essentially free for the taking, having gone feral during the years when Texas men were away fighting the war. A steer that might fetch $1 or $2 in Texas could sell for $30 or $40 in the beef-hungry markets of Uncas, Kansas City, Chicago, or New York. The math was impossible to ignore, and so the cattle drive was born. Ranchers began organizing enormous movements of livestock across hundreds of miles of open country, pushing her herds northward to the railroad towns of Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, where the beef could be loaded onto trains and shipped east. These drives would define the cowboy era, and the men who rode them would define cowboy himself. The cattle drive was not a romantic adventure. It was a grueling commercial enterprise, a moving factory in which the product walked on four legs, and the laborers rode in the saddle for months at a time, sleeping on the ground, eating trail food, and earning wages that today would barely cover a cup of coffee. The great trails of the cattle drive era have passed into American mythology. The Chisholm Trail, named for Jesse Chisholm, a trader of Cherokee and Scottish descent, who blazed portions of the route, ran from southern Texas through Indian Territory to the Kansas railheads over its peak years of operation from roughly 1867 to the late 1880s. Some 3 and 5 million cattle were driven north along its path. The Western Trail, also known as the Dodge City Trail, carried cattle further west to the booming stockyards of Dodge City. The Goodnight Loving Trail, pioneered by cattlemen Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, pushed west into New Mexico and north into Colorado and Wyoming, opening the northern ranges to Texas beef. These trails were not roads. They were routes, shifting corridors of movement across open land, following rivers when possible, avoiding rough terrain when practical, and adapting to the realities of weather, water, and the availability of grass. A herd, 2,000 cattle might stretch for several miles along the trail. A slow-moving river of hooves and horns, raining a cloud of visible for miles. The men who moved them lived entirely outdoors for the duration of the drive, which might last 2 to 4 months depending on the distance and the conditions encountered along the way. To call the cowboys' life difficult would be an understatement that borders on absurdity. It was physically demanding as most modern people can barely imagine. The work required riding for 10 to 14 hours a day, often in extreme heat, through choking dust across rivers that could rise overnight into dangerous floods. It required the ability to handle large, unpredictable animals in tight situations, spruced and inst to spawn panic of a herd on the verge of a stampede. To function on minimal sleep through nights of thunderstorm and darkness, and it required all of this for wages that were modest even by the standards of the time. To $25 to $40 a month for a working co-hand, some were for experienced trail bosses. Yet men came. They came from the depleted farms of the post-war South, from the cities of the East, from Mexico, and from the free black communities. After emancipation, they came because the West offered something the settled East could not. the possibility of open space of movement, of a life lived outside the confines of factory or field. And they came because the cattle industry needed them, was willing to hire almost anyone, any who could sit a horse and endure the demands. The cowboy era, in its purest form, was brief, from approximately 1866 to 1890. The great cattle drives rolled north along the trails, and the cowboy, as a cultural type, crystallized into a recognizable figure. But by the late 1880s, the era was already ending. Barbed wire, patented 77. And spreading across the plains through the late 1870s and 1880s, was dividing the open range into fenced pastures. The railroads were extending their reach to Texas itself, eliminating the need for long drives. A series of brutal winters in 1886 and Essington 1887 and 1887 destroyed enormous percentages of the cattle herds on the northern ranges, devastating the industry and forcing ranchers to adopt new, more sustainable practices. The cowboy did not disappear, but he changed from the free-ranging trail rider of the drive era to the ranch hand of the settled West, a working man on somebody else's land, doing a job that had become more routine, more bounded, more like form of agricultural labor. But at that brief period between ending of the Civil War and the closing of the open range, the American cowboy created something that would outlast the cattle drives by generations. A mythology, an image, a set of values and aesthetics that would shape American culture for more than a century after the last great trail herds reached their destinations. To understand that mythology, you must understand the reality that underlies it. The actual daily life of the men who rode the ranges, drove the herds, and slept beneath the enormous western sky. Chapter 2. Hired and saddled of cowboy life. A cowboy began not with the romance of the open range, but with the practical reality of employment. Most cowboys were working men, hired hands, who sold their labor to ranchers and trail bosses in exchange for wages, food, and whatever shelter the job provided. Understanding the economic structure of cowboy life is essential to understanding the actual experience of the men who lived it. Because everything about their daily existence, what they ate, where they slept, what equipment they used, what risks they took, was shaped by the economics of the cattle industry. The hiring process was informal by modern standards. Looking for work might approach a ranch headquarters, speak to the foreman or the owner, and be judged on the spot based on his apparent ability and demeanor. There were no formal applications, no background checks in any modern sense, no guaranteed duration of employment. Cowboy might be hired for a specific trail drive and let go when it ended. or he might stay year-round employment on a large ranch. The distinction between these two situations was significant. Trail driving paid somewhat better, but offered no permanence, while ranch work was steadier but often paid less. Wages varied by region, time period, and the specific demands of the job. In the early years of the cattle drive era, a working cowboy might earn between $20 and $30 a month. By the 1880s, wages had risen somewhat, with experienced cowhands earning $30 to $40 monthly, and trail bosses, the men responsible for managing entire drives, earning considerably more, sometimes $75 to $100 a month or more. These figures may seem trivial today, but in the context of the 70s economy, they were neither exceptional nor destitute. A factory worker in the East might earn comparable wages under far worse conditions. What made cowboy wages distinctive was what they did and did not include. On a trail drive, the cowboy received his wages plus meals prepared by the cook from the chuck wagon. The use of a string of horses provided by the outfit. He did not pay for room since he slept outside. He did not generally pay for food on the trail, but he was expected to provide his own saddle, his own bedroll, and his own clothing, including boots, hats, chaps, and spurs. These items represented its significant investments. A good saddle might cost cowboy 2 to 4 months' wages. Were expensive. A proper hat was not cheap. The practical tools of the trade were the cowboy's own responsibility to acquire and maintain. This economic reality shaped the cowboy's relationship to his equipment in a way that goes beyond mere practicality. A cowboy's saddle was perhaps his most prized possession, carefully selected, broken in over years of use, personalized through the tools and hung from it, and carried from job to job as one of the few things he truly owned. When a cowboy moved on from one employer to another, his horse might belong to the ranch, but his saddle went with him. It was professional tool, his identity as a working horseman, and sometimes his bed when the ground was particularly hard. The outfit, the ranch or trail drive operation that employed a cowboy, provided horses, and this arrangement was central to the economics of the work. Most outfits maintained what was called a remuda, a string of horses available for use by the cowboys. On a trail drive, a cowboy might have a string of six to 10 horses assigned to his use, rotating through them to prevent any single animal from being ridden to exhaustion. The horse wrangler, often least experienced member of a trail crew, was responsible for managing the remuda, keeping the horses together, moving them ahead of the herd, and ensuring they were available when needed. The horses themselves were typically purebreds of distinguished lineage. They were working horses, often of mixed breeding, selected for endurance, sure-footedness, and trainability rather than speed or beauty. The ideal cowboy horse was what riders called a cow horse. An animal that had learned to work cattle instinctively, that would hold a rope taut while a cowboy dismounted to work a tied calf, that would turn with a cutting maneuver without explicit guidance, that remained calm in the midst of a thundering herd. Such horses were invaluable, and it ends. It's Newhound's judge, Houge horseflesh, with the same critical eye they applied to everything else that mattered to their survival and their work. Employment on a working ranch differed from trail driving in important ways. The ranch cowboy's year followed a seasonal rhythm determined by the needs of the cattle and the requirements of the land. Spring brought roundup, the intensive gathering of cattle from the open range, the sorting and branding of calves, the culling and selection of animals for various purposes. This was a period intense, collaborative work, often involving cowboys from multiple ranches working together across shared rangeland. Summer brought the relative quiet of routine ranch work. Fence repair, water management, caring for the herd. Fall brought the second roundup of the year and the selection of cattle for market. Winter was the quietest season, though it carried its own demands and dangers. The ranch hierarchy was clear. At the top was the owner, who might or might be present at the ranch itself. Absentee ownership became increasingly common industry evening at Eastern and foreign investment capital during the 1870s and 1870s and 80s. Below the owner was the ranch manager or foreman, the man responsible for day-to-day operations. Below him were the working cowboys, who might number anywhere from a handful on small operations to dozens on the great ranches of Texas, Wyoming, and Montana. At the bottom of the ranch hierarchy was the horse wrangler and the cook, both of whom occupied but lower status roles. The cook, properly called the cookie by most cowboys, occupied a position of remarkable importance, despite his relatively low formal status. On a trail drive, the cook and his chuck wagon were the logistical center of the entire operation. He rose before everyone else, prepared breakfast in the dark before dawn, drove the wagon ahead of the herd to the next designated camp, had a meal ready when the herd arrived, prepared supper, and then rose again in the early hours to repeat the cycle. A good cook was prized beyond almost any other member of a trail crew, and an experienced trail boss would invest serious effort in securing the services of a reliable, competent one. A bad cook, on the other hand, could destroy the morale of an entire outfit. Cowboys who would endure almost any physical hardship without complaint would become mutinous over consistently bad food. The economics of cowboy employment contained a significant racial dimension that is often glossed over in popular accounts of the era. It is estimated that somewhere between 25 and 35% of cowboys working in the cattle trails, chills in the post-Civil War period were black. And a substantial and additional percentage of Mexican descent. These men did the same work, faced the same dangers, and endured the same hardships as their white counterparts. They did not, however, typically receive the same wasim or opportunities for advancement. Black cowboys faced discrimination in trail towns, denied service in saloons and restaurants that white cowboys frequented, excluded from certain social spaces, subject to the racial hierarchies of a society only recently emerged from slavery. Yet they were there in substantial numbers doing the work, contributing to the industry, and shaping the culture of the range in ways that history has been slow to acknowledge. Among the most celebrated figures of the cowboy era were men like Nat Love, a formerly enslaved man who became one of the most ropers and writers in the West, and wrote a colorful, if somewhat embellished, autobiography of his experiences. Bose Acard, a trusted hand of the legendary cattleman Charles Goodnight, was described by Guy Goodnight himself as the most skilled and dependable cowboy he had ever known. These men and thousands like them were essential to the operation of the cattle industry. Yet their stories were largely erased from the popular mythology that emerged in dime novels and later films. The economic precarity of cowboy life was real and constant. Most cowboys saved little or from their wages. Towns at the end of the trail, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, were designed essentially to extract the wages that cowboys had accumulated over months of hard work. Saloons, gambling establishments, and other entertainment venues competed vigorously for the biz for. And most cowboys, young and often footloose, were willing participants in their own financial undoing. The image of the cowboy riding into town after months on the trail and blowing his entire wages in a few days as of celebrate is not a myth. It was a common reality documented in the records of the time. This financial improvidence was not simply a character failing. It reflected the structure of a life without security, without savings mechanisms, without pensions or benefits of any kind. Cowboy who was injured could not work and therefore could not earn, and there was no social safety net to catch him. A cowboy who grew too old for the physical demands faced a difficult future. There were few alternatives, little accumulated wealth, and their labor market that had little use for men whose working lives were defined entirely by skills specific to an industry that was itself being transformed. The cowboys' economic reality was, in many respects, an early and particularly stark example of the broader insecurity that characterized working-class life in industrial America. Chapter 3: Dawn to Dusk. Daily work, the daily life of a working cowboy bore almost Noah's resemblance to the action-packed adventures depicted in dime novels and later in Western films. The reality was dominated not by gunfights and heroic rescues, but by repetitive, physically demanding labor, constant attention to the needs of large animals, and the management of monotony under conditions genuine physical hardship. To understand how cowboys actually lived is through their days with some precision. On a cattle drive, the day began before dawn. The cook rose first, typically around 3:30 in the morning, to start the fire and begin breakfast. By 4 or 4:30, the night herders would come in from their final shift around the bedded cattle, and the cowboys assigned to the first guard shift of the new day would take their places. Breakfast was eaten quickly in the darkness or the earliest gray light of dawn, and by first light the herd was being pushed to its feet and moving. The basic structure of the drive was simple in concept, demanding in execution. The herd moved forward during the daylight hours, typically covering between 10 and 15 miles on a good day, less on the rugged terrain or in bad weather. At the front of the herd were the point riders, the most experienced men who guided the lead cattle in the desired direction. Behind them, along the sides of the herd, were the swing riders and flank riders responsible for keeping the cattle moving in a cohesive group and preventing them from straying or bunching. At the rear of the herd, eating the worst dust and dealing with the slowest and most difficult animals were the drag riders, typically the least east cowboys, who earned their position at the bottom of the trail hierarchy by being new to the work. The dust was perhaps the most universally complained about aspect of trail driving. A herd of 2,000 cattle moving across dry plains generated a cloud of fine, choking dust that hung in the air for hours. The drag riders at the back of the herd were enveloped in this cloud almost continuously during dry weather. Most cowboys carried bandanas specifically to tie over their nose and mouths and mouth in dusty conditions, a practical measure that has become of the most iconic visual elements of the cowboy image. The dust penetrated everything: clothing, bedding, food, water, eyes, and lungs. Water was a constant preoccupation on the trail. The cattle needed to drink it every day, and the trail boss planned each day's movement with water sources firmly in mind. Rivers and streams were primary sources, and the timing of a herd's arrival at a crossing was an important logistical consideration. The animals needed to be watered but not so thoroughly that they became sluggish and difficult to move. The crossing itself was often dangerous. Cattle panic in moving water, and the combination of a large herd, a strong current, and startled animals could result in chaos, injury, and death for both cattle and the men trying to manage them. River crossings were among the most genuinely dangerous moments of a trail drive. Cowboys who could not swim, and many could not, faced real peril when their horses lost footing in a swift current. Cowboys did drown on the trails along with cattle. The rivers of the Central Plains, the Canadian, the Arkansas, the Red, the Cimarron, the Plata, each had their own characteristics and their own dangers. Experienced trail bosses learned the habits of these rivers, knew where the best crossing points were, and understood how rising water, after distant rains, could transform a placid stream into a treacherous torrent overnight. Stampedes were the other great danger of the trail drive, and they could come almost any cause. A sudden sound, a clap of thunder, the rattle of a cook's pan, a horse stumbling in the dark could send two cattle running in a blind panic. Stampedes at night were particularly terrifying. Cowboys would ride into the darkness, trying to get a head of running herd and turn the lead cattle in a circular direction. A maneuver called milling the herd, that caused the stampeding animals to run in a runny decreasing spiral and until they exhausted themselves and could be stopped. This required riding at speed in a darkness across unfamiliar terrain, a genuinely life-threatening activity. Cows were killed by stampedes thrown from their horses, trampled by the running cattle, or lost in the darkness and unable to find their way back to camp. The night guard was a daily reality of trail life that few accounts adequately convey. The cattle had to be watched through the night, and the night and nut that every cowboy spent a portion of each night in the saddle, circling the bedded herd. The night was divided into shifts, typically 2 hours each, and every man took his turn. Night guard had its own particular discomforts: the cold, the darkness, the loneliness, and the constant vigilance required to detect the first signs of restlessness in the herd before it became a stampede. Cowboys on night guard often sang to the cattle, not for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones. The steady sound of a human voice seemed to calm the animals and mask the small sounds of the night that might otherwise startle them. The songs of the cowboy, which became a genuine musical tradition with its own extensive repertoire, originated largely in this practical necessity. The work of the roundup on a cattle ranch, the cow ranch, was different from trail driving, but no less demanding. Twice a year, in spring and fall, cowboys from a region would gather to round up the cattle that dispersed across the open range. The spring roundup was the most important, as it was when calves born during the winter were branded. bird earmarked to identify their ownership. The fall roundup determined which animals would be selected for sale and which would winter on the range. A roundup was a cooperative enterprise, with cowboys from multiple ranches working together, each ranch's representative, called a rep, responsible for identifying and cutting out that ranch's cattle from the general herd. Roping and branding calves was skilled, dangerous work. The roper had to accurately drop over or a running calf, secure it, and hold it while ground workers applied the brand, castrated male calves, and earmarked the animals. A missed throw or a rope around the wrong animal could create chaos. A horse that didn't hold the rope taw could allow a half-branded calf to escape. The work done at speed, in dust, and in noise. Precise coordination between the mounted roper and the ground crew. Branding itself was straightforward in concept. A concept. A hot iron applied to the animal's hull's hide leaves a permanent mark indicating ownership. But it required practice to apply cleanly and correctly. A poorly applied brand could be altered by rustlers or confused with other marks. The brands used by ranches were registered with territorial or state authorities and were as legally significant as signatures on documents. Brand design, careful business, and the reading of brands was a skill that was cultivated with the same care they brought to any other aspect of their craft. Beyond the dramatic moments of the trail drive and the roundup, much ranch cowboy life was simply maintenance. Fences needed repair, especially as barbed wire spread across the West in the 1880s. Tanks and windmills needed maintenance. Sick cattle needed attention. Horses needed shoeing. Feed needed to be distributed in winter when snow covered the grass. Harness and equipment needed to be repaired and cared for. A range of working enterprise required constant attention to keep functioning. The cowboy who imagined his life would consist of exciting rides and dramatic encounters was quickly disabused of that by the reality of daily life on a working ranch. The cowboy's relationship with his horse deserves Surish Latent because it was central relationship of his working life. A cowboy spent more time with his horse than with any human companion, and the quality of that relationship directly determined the quality and safety of his work. Breaking horses, training green animals, and work cattle was a specialized skill, and the men who did it well were valued accordingly. The process of breaking a horse in the cowboy era was typically faster and rougher than modern methods. A bronc-buster would ride a wild or green horse until it stopped bucking, and would repeat this process until the animal accepted the saddle and rider as a matter of course. The horse might be functional as a working animal within a few days by this method. though true mastery of a cow horse required much longer. The Fairfull Smith studs of Hork Direct Deck Trust, the best cowboys went far beyond simply staying in the saddle. It included understanding how to communicate to horse through subtle shifts of weight, and how to position a horse correctly for roping or cutting, how to read a horse's mood and anticipate its reactions, to how to care her horse's physical condition during the stresses of hard work. The best cowboys were in many respects the best horsemen, and they understood horses with an intimacy born of constant, close, mutual dependence. Chapter 4: Fur, Shelter, and Survival. The material conditions of cowboy life were Spartan by any measure, and the contrast between those conditions and the pillar in the popular image of the cowboy is one of the starkest differences between history and myth. The cowboy did not live in comfortable ranch houses with warm fires and well-appointed dining rooms. For much his working life, he lived outdoors, sleeping on the ground, eating from a chuck wagon, and making do with what he could carry and what the landscape provided. The chuck wagon was the material center of a trail drive, and its contents were chosen with considerable care. Charles Goodnight, the cattleman, who is generally credited with designing and commissioning the first purpose-built chuck wagon in 1866, created a vehicle that would become the template for trail cooking for the next 2 decades. The chuck wagon was a modified farm with a chuck box, a deep wooden cabinet met at the rear that contained the cook's tools, ingredients, and supplies. When the lid of the chuck box was lowered, it became a work surface, hinged at the bottom and supported by a leg. The chuck box held coffee, flour, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods, cooking utensils, and the small personal items that cowboys entrusted to the cook for safekeeping. The basic diet on a trail drive was monotonous, calorie-dense, and heavily weighted toward a few staple foods. Beans, typically dried pinto beans, cooked slowly overnight in a Dutch oven and ready by morning, were the foundation of most trail meals. Coffee, strong and black, was consumed in enormous quantities. Cowboys typically drank several cups at each meal and carried it with them in tin cups through the day. Sourdough biscuits made from a starter that a good cook kept alive and protected like a precious resource were a trail stake. Bin Dutch ups buried in coals or suspended over fire. Salt pork, dried beef, and occasionally fresh beef from animals slaughtered along the trail provided protein. Canned goods, tomatoes, peaches, and other fruits were expensive luxuries that appeared only occasionally. The Dutch oven, a cast iron pot with a tight-fitting lid and legs to standing coals, was perhaps the single most important piece of cooking equipment in the cowboy's world. It could bake, stew, fry, and roast, and a skilled cook could produce a remarkable range of dishes from it. The care and maintenance of cast iron cookware was taken seriously. A properly seasoned Dutch oven was non-stick and easy to clean, while a neglected one was a source of constant frustration. Cowboys who were careless with the cook's equipment learned quickly such carelessness consequences. Fresh vegetables were rare on the trail, and in many ranch environments, the cowboy diet was notably deficient in vitamins and fresh produce, a fact that contributed to various nutritional problems, though these not well understood medically at the time. Occasional wild game, deer, antelope, rabbits, supplemented the trail diet when circumstances allowed, and some cooks developed considerable skill at making the most of whatever the land provided. But the essential diet was beans, biscuits, beef, and coffee, and this remained true for months at a stretch. Water quality was an ongoing concern. The rivers and streams of the Central Plains were often alkaline, particularly in dry summer conditions, and drinking poor quality water could cause illness in both cattle and humans. Experienced waters were safe and which should be avoided. And they learned to treat dubious water with a handful of coffee grounds or other improvised methods. Waterborne illness was a real danger on the trail, though cowboys were generally reluctant to admit weakness of any kind. Sleeping arrangements on a trail drive consisted of a bedroll, a wadroll, a waterproof canvas tarpaulin wrapped around wool blankets or a quilt. Spread on the ground near the chuck wagon, there were no tents for ordinary cowboys. These were expensive and heavy, and the culture of the trail valued the ability to sleep and ain't. A cowboy who insisted on special accommodations would have been ridiculed out of camp. The bedroll was folded and loaded onto the chuck wagon each morning and was the cowboy's only personal sleeping space for the duration of the drive. Weather was not simply an inconvenience. It was a genuine physical threat. Summer on the southern plains could produce temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's Hostin, one Flafon, working hard in the sun with little shade available. Summer thunderstorms on the plains be violent and dangerous. Lightning, hail, and the sudden roaring rainfall that could turn a dry creek bed into a flash flood within minutes. Winter on the northern plains, Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas was brutally cold, and any cowboy who had to work cattle during a blizzard faced genuine risk of freezing to death. The clothing cowboys wore was not selected for appearance but function. Though over time, a cowboy's outfit did a distinctive if that served specific practical purposes. The broad-brimmed hat, the Stetson, after Philadelphia hatter John B. Stetson, who designed a practical working hat, working specifically for the Western ape market in the 1860s was essential. Its wide brim shaded the face from brutal sun, channeled rain away from the neck, and could be used as a water vessel in emergencies. The high crown provided insulation from both heat and cold. The Stetson's distinctive silhouette became iconic precisely because it was the optimal design for the conditions faced. High-heeled boots served purposes that were entirely practical. The heel prevented the foot from sliding through the stirrup, a dangerous occurrence that could result in a cowboy being dragged by a spooked horse. The pointed toe made it easier to find the stirrup. When mounting, the boot's stiff upper protected the ankle and lower leg from brush and rope burns. Seriously, caring for them with oils and greases to preserve the leather. And a good pair of boots was expected to last for years. The distinctive walking gait of a man who has spent years in cowboy boots, slightly stiff, is not an affectation, but a natural consequence of footwear designed use in stirrups rather than on foot. Chaps, leather leggings worn over pants, protected the legs from brush and the horns of cattle. They came in several styles suited to different conditions. The shotgun chap was a simple tube of leather, warm and protective in cold weather. The batwing chap, wide and fringed, allowed greater freedom of movement and was popular in warmer climates. The woolly chap, covered with sheepskin or Angora goat hair, provided exceptional insulation in cold weather. Cowboys in different regions adopted different styles of chaps on the local ginzans, and these variations contributed the diverse vocabulary of cowboy dress. The bandana, a large cotton kerchief, was perhaps the most versatile item of cowboy equipment. It covered the face against dust, served a sweat rag in heat, could be soaked in grease and watched against the neck to cool the body, functioned as a sling if an arm was injured, and had dozens of other improvised uses. Cowboys typically owned several and carried one around their neck at all times. Personal hygiene on the trail was minimal by modern standards. Not through indifference, but through the absence for anything better. A cowboy might go weeks being opportunities bathes. Rivers provided the most common bathing spots, and the arrival of a trail drive at a river crossing often included a round of swimming and washing that served as personal hygiene as much as recreation. Shaving, similarly, infrequent. And many cowboys grew beards simply because shaving on the trail was difficult and uncomfortable. Healthcare was primitive and expensive. Medical services in the frontier West were sparse, and a cowboy who was seriously injured on a trail drive, a desperate situation, the cook sometimes functioned as an impromptu medic. treating wounds with whatever was available, whiskey for disinfection, beef tallow for burns, various herbal preparations with traditions drawn from Mexican folk medicine. Broken bones were sometimes set and splinted by fellow cowboys with no medical training whatsoever. Serious illness, appendicitis, for example, or a deep infection, could be fatal simply because proper medical care was not available within any reasonable distance. The ranch bunkhouse, when it existed, represented a step up from the open ground the trail drive. Typical bunkhouse was a simple wooden structure, usually one large room furnished with wooden bunk beds, a central stove for heat, and minimal other amenities. Cowboys kept their personal belongings in a small space around their assigned bunk. Saddle, bedroll, spare clothing, personal items. Bunkhouse could be crowded and uncomfortable, but it offered shelter from the elements, and the social life of the working ranch. Chapter 5. The code and the culture, values, community, and identity among the most enduring signifier is the legacies of the OA area, is the informal code of the conduct that governed life on the range and the trail. This code was not written down in any formal document. It did not originate with any particular individual or organization. It evolved organically from the practical necessities of life in isolated conditions, where men were dependent on each other for survival, and where the formal institutions of law and social order were distant or non-existent. The cowboy code was, at its core, a set of practical virtues refined by necessity, and it left a mark on American culture that persists to this day. Reliability was perhaps the highest virtue in the cowboy's ethical world. A man who could be counted on, who would do what he said, who would be where he was supposed to be, who would hold up his end of whatever task had been assigned to him. Tim was worth any number of more glamorous but less dependable companions. Was not mere moral sentiment. On a trail drive, an unreliable man could cost the outfit cattle, horses or lives. A cowboy who fell asleep on night guard might allow a herd to scatter who couldn't hold his place during a river crossing endangered everyone. The premium placed on reliability in cowboy culture was a direct expression of the cost of its absence. Honesty was valued to a degree that might surprise modern observers who think of the frontier West primarily interiorly in terms of its violence and lawlessness. A cowboy's word was considered binding in absence of written contracts, because in a world of limited record keeping and limited legal infrastructure, a man's reputation for keeping his word was his most important credential. A cowboy who lied, who cheated it at cards or in business dealings, who failed to honor a commitment, damaged a reputation that was almost impossible to rebuild in communities where everyone knew everyone and news traveled fast along the trails. The term is good was a serious professional endorsement in this world. Generosity was another virtue that the cowboy code elevated. And again, this was not simply idealism. The realities of trail life required that men share food, water, supplies, labor, and assistance in times of difficulty. Cowboy who refused to share with a man in need was not merely uncharitable. He was a threat to the social fabric that allowed everyone to survive. The tradition of the open range dictated to any rider who arrived at a ranch headquarters or injured, fed, housed, and treated with basic courtesy, regardless of whether he was known to the owners. This hospitality ethic was not forced by law, but by the shared understanding that the man you turned away today might be the man whose help you needed tomorrow. Stoicism in the face of hardship was almost a defining characteristic of cowboy identity, complaining about physical discomfort, cold, heat, bad food, if conditions was considered weakness, and cowboys held themselves to a standard of endurance that would be considered extreme by contemporary norms. This stoicism was partly psychological. Men who were going to months of genuine hardship, needed to maintain a mental posture that allowed them to function despite physical misery. And part cultural performance, a way of demonstrating fitness for the demanding life they had chosen. Cowboys teased and mocked each other's claims with the casual cruelty of men who could not afford to acknowledge their own suffering. And a man who endured hardship without complaint earned respect of his companions in ways that no other behavior could quite replicate. The relationship between cowboys' violence, complicated and frequently misrepresented. The popular imagery of the cowboy as a man who settled disputes with a gun, who lived and died by the iron on his hip, who was constantly involved in deadly confrontations, is product of novel fiction and cinematic convention rather than historical reality. Most cowboys did firearms, typically a pistol and sometimes a rifle, but primarily for practical reasons. Protection against predatory animals, the need to kill an injured animal quickly, the occasional management of snakes, the dramatic gunfights that dominate Western film and fiction were relatively rare events. And most cowboys through their entire working lives without ever drawing a weapon against another person. This is not to say that violence was absent from cowboy life. Trail towns like Dodge City and Abilene experienced significant violence. And the conflicts between cattlemen and farmers, between large operations and small landholders, between established interests and newcomers, did sometimes turn deadly. The Lincoln County War in New Mexico, the Johnson County War in Wyoming, the fence-cutting conflicts across Texas were real events in which real people died, but they were dramatic exceptions to the mundane reality of daily life. And the men involved in them were often more as Renamsen and actors. Grievances and interests. The social life of cowboys was limited by geography and circumstance, but was not non-existent. On the trail, the period after supper and before first night guard shift time was assault time. Men talked, told stories, played cards, sang, and generally enjoyed the company of their companions. Storytelling was a valued skill, and a man who could hold an audience around the campfire with a well-told tale, whether true or embellished, earned a social currency, transiti, that translated into popularity and status in the group. The cowboy humor that emerged from these campfire sessions was characteristically dry, ironic, self-deprecating. A humor that found comedy in hardship and absurdity in the pretensions of the world beyond the trail. Music was important to cowboy culture in ways that went beyond simple entertainment. The songs that cowboys sang on night guard, around the campfire, and during long boring stretches of trail work represented a genuine folk music tradition with its own distinctive character. Many cowboy songs were adaptations of earlier folk songs from the British Isles or the American South, with new words fitted to existing melodies. Others were original compositions, sometimes written by cowboys themselves and passed along orally through the tradition. Songs like Get Along Little Doties, Home on the Range, The Old Chisholm Trail, and Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie became foundational texts of American folk music, carried out of the cowboy world into the culture where they found audiences far beyond the men who first sang them. Religion occupied a complicated place in cowboy life. Many cowboys were not actively religious in any conventional sense. They were separated from churches and organized worship for most of their working lives. And the culture of the trail did not particularly encourage formal piety. Yet, spiritual dimension of cowboy life was real. Expressed through doctrine and institutions, then through an intense awareness of the natural world and a respect for its power. A man who had ridden through a plains thunderstorm or watched the sun rise over empty miles of range, or lay on his back looking at the vast density of stars visible from a campfire in a world without artificial light, had experienced something that touched the human sense of transcendence in a way that required no theological articulation. The racial and ethnic diversity of the cowboy world created a complex soul environment that is rarely acknowledged in popular treatments of the subject. Cowboys worked alongside men of different grounds, race, and nationalities in conditions that required cooperation, regardless of social prejudice. A black cowboy who was denied service in a trail town saloon might nonetheless be trusted completely with the night guard. Ard, relied upon in a river crossing, and respected for his horsemanship by the same white cowboys who observed the racial conventions of the broader society. This was not racial harmony. The discrimination was real, and its consequences were real. But it was a more complex situation than simple apartheid, and it produced relationships and shared experiences that crossed all lines in ways that the settled society of the era generally did not. The cowboys' relationship to the land deserves consideration as a cultural and psychological matter, not just a practical one. Men who spent months or years working on the open range developed an intimate knowledge of the country they traveled, its geography, its weather patterns, its water sources, its hazards, and its beauties. They developed what can only be described as the relationship as the lands belonged to a particular stretch of country that was as practical. The attachment that cowboys poros expressed for specific trails, specific ranges, specific rivers and hills was genuine and deep. It was one of the things that made the closing of the open range by barbed wire and settlement so psychologically difficult for the generation that experienced it. The land they had known as open and limitless became divided and bounded. And something essential in the cowboys' world was lost with that enclosure. Chapter 6. The Trail Towns. Life at the end of the line for months on end. A cowboy on a trail drive saw nothing but sky, grass, cattle, and the faces of his companions. The trail towns at the end of the drive, Abilene, Dodge City, Caldwell, Ellsworth, represented everything that thing had been absent during those months. Women, whiskey, music, gambling, bailings, crowds, and the noise and energy of a settled human community. The arrival of a trail drive at one of these towns was an event of genuine economic sense and consensuality and understanding what actually happened. There is essential to understanding the cowboy's life as a whole. The trail towns of Kansas were creatures of the cattle industry. Abilene, the first of the great cattle towns, was transformed from a small, unremarkable settlement into a roaring commercial center almost overnight after entrepreneur Joseph McCoy. As McCoy established a stockyard there in 867, and in painted 67, and invited Texas cattlemen to bring their herds north to meet the Kansas Pacific Railroad. Within a few years, the pattern was established. Texas herds arrived during the summer months. The cattle were sold and shipped east, and the cowboys who had driven them spent their accumulated wages in the town's proliferating commercial establishments. The economics of a trail town were straightforward. The cattle buyers, representing packing houses and wholesale buyers from eastern cities, met with the trail bosses and ranch owners to negotiate prices for the herds. These transactions were the serious business of the cattle industry, involving large sums of money and complex negotiations over the quality, weight, and condition of the animals. The trail boss was often responsible for managing these negotiations and ensuring that the outfit's cattle brought the best bull price. For the working cowboys, the transaction was simpler. They received their wages, the accumulated earnings of the months on the trail, and were then free to spend it as they chose. The establishments waiting to assist them in this endeavor were numerous and varied. Saloons were the primary social institution of the trail town, offering whiskey, beer, music, gambling, and female companionship in varying combinations. A well-appointed saloon in Dodge City or Abilene might have at a substantial wooden bar, paintings on the walls, a piano or small band in the corner, gambling tables in the back, and upstairs rooms accessible for additional payment. Less refined establishments offered less comfortable surroundings but equally available services. The famous lawlessness of the trail towns had considerably exaggerated in popular memory, but was not entirely fictional. The combination of large numbers of young men, large amounts of cash, large quantities of alcohol, and release of months of pent tension created conditions that could become volatile. Most trail towns experienced significant violence during their peak years of operation. Murders, stabbings, shootings, and general disorder were documented facts of life in Dodge City during the 1870s. Towns hired marshals and ordinances regulations, including ordinances requiring cowboys check their firearms and at the end, specifically to manage the disorder that accompanied the drives. The famous lawmen associated with the cattle towns, Wyatt Earp, Dodge City, and later Tombstone, Wild Bill Hill in Hickok in Abilene, Bat Masterson in various Kansas communities, were real historical figures, though their exploits were substantially inflated by the dime novel writers and journalists who discovered Western violence, sold papers, and pamphlets. Wyatt Earp worked as a lawman in Dodge City from 1 Delta 8 1876 to 1 10th 1879, during which time the town did experience significant violence, and he did use force to enforce the law, but that the gunfighter mythology that grew up around him and his contemporaries was substantially a product of promotion and embellishment rather than straightforward historical record. What is often overlooked in the popular treatment of trail town violence is the degree to which it was managed and contained by the towns themselves. The merchants, hotel owners, and businessmen of Dodge City had an obvious economic interest in maintaining order sufficient to keep the cattle trade coming. A town was genuinely the only uncontrolled and dangerous would drive away the commerce that sustained it. The balance struck in places like Dodge City. Enough tolerance for cowboy entertainment to keep the business coming. Enough let the town from collapsing into chaos. Was a carefully managed commercial calculation. Not absence of governance. The social interactions between cowboys and the permanent residents of the trail towns were complex. Cowboys, for their money, often regarded a mixture of contempt, wariness by the settled community. They were seen as rough, dirty, and men who passed through, spent their wages, moved on, leaving the community with whatever disorder their passage created. The stereotype of the cowboy as the dangerous roughneck, partly by the same dime novels that romanticized them, and the attitudes of townspeople toward the men who were, in an important sense, their seasonal economic foundation. Women in the trail towns occupied a variety of roles that the popular Western narrative tends to collapse into a simply dichotomy of good women and bad women. The wives, daughters, and female servants of the permanent community. Shop owners, merchants, farmers represented respectability and domestic order. The women who worked in saloons, and brothels, who were typically called soiled doves in the politely euphemistic language, Viera, represented the other end of the social spectrum, being in establishments that existed specifically to extract money from trail cowboys in exchange for company and services. The women who worked in the saloons and trail towns deserve his careful historic consideration than they typically receive. Many were there not by choice in any meaningful sense, but by economic necessity. The options available to women of limited means in frontier communities were severely restricted, and the wages paid in these establishments, however morally stigmatized, were often the only available income. Their lives were difficult, often dangerous, and frequently short. Disease, violence from clients, and the social ostracism that accompanied their bare profession combined to make the lives of working women, king women in the trail towns, genuinely hard. The cowboys' relationship with the established law in trail towns was transactional and pragmatic. Cowboys who were celebrating might be arrested, fined, and released. The fine serving as an efficient mechanism for transferring some of the cowboys' wages into the town's coffers. Though committed genuine violence might face more serious consequences. But the general approach of trail town law and town law enforcement was management rather than oppression. Keeping the boys spending money while preventing the worst excesses that would make the town genuinely unsafe for other inhabitants. After a few days in a trail town, or sometimes as a week, for those who managed their money carefully, most cowboys had spent the majority of their wages and were ready to begin the journey home. This journey was often made by rail for at least part of the distance. The railroad that had made the cattle trade, now carrying the cowboys toward Texas. Some stayed in Kansas, moved on to other cattle regions, finding work on the great northern ranges of Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Others joined new trail crews forming for the next season. A few made enough to stake a small ranch of their own, though this was the achievement of a minority. The psychological experience of the trail town, the explosion of stimulation, and after months of isolation and monotony, the rapid expenditure of hard-earned wages, the brief immersion in the noise and color of a commercial community is an important part of understanding the cowboy's life. As a whole, the trail town, not simply a place where a cowboys behaved badly. It was the social safety valve of an otherwise intensely demanding existence. The release point for months accumulated and psychological pressure that this release often took self-destructive forms was not incidental. It reflected the absence of healthier alternatives in a life that offered little, that was not hard. Chapter 7. The orange and closest transformation and clout. Nothing lasts forever. And the cowboy era of the open range was no exception to this universal truth. The very forces that made the great cattle drives, the vast open grasslands, absence of boundaries, the availability of free grass and water, were already being undermined before the era reached its peak. And by the late 1880s, the world that had created the cowboy as a distinctive cultural type styptic. The transition from the open range to the fenced settled west, one of the most significant agricultural, transcultural, and transformations in American. And it's the nature of cowboy life permanently, the invention and commercialization of barbed wire was perhaps the single most important development in this transformation. Joseph Glidden of DeKalb, Illinois, patented his design for wire in 1974, and within a decade, hundreds of millions of pounds of the material were being produced annually and spread across the western plains. Barbed wire allowed landowners to fence enormous areas at relatively low cost. Previously, the expense then of building wooden fences across the treeless plains have made enclosure impractical. With barbed wire, a farmer to protect his crops from grazing cattle. A rancher cut his pasture from competing grazers. In range, the commons on which the cattle industry had depended could be divided into private property. The spread of barbed wire across the West triggered serious clash. Texas. Fence cutting wars broke out in the early 880s. Cattlemen who depended on access to open range, especially the smaller operators who did not own enough land to fence their own pastures, sometimes attempted to enclosure by cutting fences that blocked their access to water or grass. This fence cutting became widespread enough that the Texas legislature criminalized it in 1884, imposing significant penalties. The conflicts were not simply about wire, they were about the fundamental question of who owned the West and had the right to use its resources. The railroads played a dual role in the transformation of the cowboy era. On one hand, they had created the IRA by providing the transportation infrastructure that made it economically viable to drive Texas cattle to distant markets. On the other hand, as the railroad network expanded into Texas itself during the 1870s and 1880s, the long trails to Kansas became unnecessary. A rancher in Central now ships cattle to Delaware by rail directly, without the expense and risk of a multi-month trail drive. The great trails, the Chisholm, the Western, the Goodnight Loving, lost their economic rationale as the railroad reached ever further into the cattle country. The catastrophic winters at 886, 887, 887, 887 dealt a devastating blow to the northern cattle ranges. A severe blizzard on the heels of a drought-stricken summer that had left the range grass short and insufficient to build the fat reserves cattle needed for winter survival, killed enormous percentages of the cattle herds Orexes from Texas to Montana, ranchers who had borrowed heavily to their ranges during the boom years, the years 8 and found themselves ruined. The great open-range cattle industry of the northern plains collapsed almost overnight, and it was replaced by a more conservative, carefully managed form of ranching that bore a little resemblance to the Shire. Oz of the trail drive era, the settlement of the plains by farmers, sometimes called nesters by cattlemen who resented their encroachment, changed the landscape in ways that made the old cattle culture increasingly untenable. The Homestead Act of 1862 and its subsequent modifications had made it possible for ordinary Americans to claim one acre plots of public land, and the completion of transcontinental railroad roads made it practical for farmers to reach and supply themselves in previously remote areas. Farm families moved onto land that cattlemen had used as the open range, planted crops that required protection from grazing animals, dug wells, built fences, and established the patchwork of private property that ultimately made the open range a memory. The conflict between cattlemen and farmers, between the open range and the settled farm, was bitter, prolonged, and occasionally violent. The cattlemen who had preceded the farmers on the range regarded the newcomers as threats to a way of life and an economic system that they had built. The farmers, for their part, had the law increasingly on their side. Homestead claims were legally protected, and the encroachment of cattle onto planted fields was a tort actionable in the increasingly available courts of the Western Territories. The cultural conflict between cowboy and became one of the defining narratives of American literature and film, usually told from the cowboy's perspective, but representing in reality the collision of two entirely legitimate but incompatible ways of using the same land. What emerged from the transformation of the late 880s and 180s and 890s was from kind of cowboy. The ranch hand of the settled West, who worked within fences rather than across open range, who drove cattle to railroad shipping points rather than across hundreds of miles of open country, who lived in a bunkhouse rather than under the stars, and who existed within the increasingly structured and legal and economic institutions of a maturing society. This cowboy was still a working man with distinctive skills and a distinctive culture, but the most heroic elements of the cowboy myth, the freedom, the vast spaces, the independence, were largely gone from his actual experience. The mythology, however, was just beginning. Paradoxically, the cowboy came most culturally prominent. Precisely the reality he represented was disappearing. Theodore Roosevelt, who spent several years as a rancher in the Dakotas during the 1880s, and wrote eloquently about the cowboy life he observed, became one of the first prominent figures to articulate the cowboy as a symbol of American national character. Hardy, self-reliant, physically capable, morally direct. Frederick Remington, the artist who spent years in the West painting cowboys, cavalrymen, and Native American, created the visual vocabulary of the cowboy that would shape American and world culture for generations. Owen Wister's novel The Virginian, published in 1942, established the template for the cowboy hero of fiction: quiet, competent, deadly, dead when provoked, morally reliable, that would be reproduced in thousands of novels, films, television programs in the century that followed. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody brought the cowboy to audiences who had never seen the West, seen the cowboys and Native Americans of the frontier in theatrical costume and staging spectacular performance that were entertainment rather than history that shaped public perception of what the West had been. Buffalo Bill himself had been a genuine frontier figure, a scout, a hunter, a marksman of real skill. But the Wild West show was a commercial entertainment that simplified and dramatized the reality of Western life and into dramatic set pieces. The show was enormously popular, touring the United States and Europe, and introducing millions of people to their idea of the American West. The cowboy passed from reality to myth within a single lifetime. A transition so rapid that men had ridden the actual trails, lived to see themselves transformed into legends. Former cowboys worked as extras in early Western films. Watching their world reimagined for an audience that they'd never known the real thing. The gap between the myth and the reality widened with each retelling, each cinematic treatment, each dime novel embellishment. Until the cowboy of popular imagination bore only a distant relationship to the working man who had actually driven cattle across the plains. The historical cowboy deserves to be understood on his own terms. Not as the gunfighting hero of Western fiction. Not as a simple laborer without cultural significance. But as a man whose life represented a particular and important intersection of economic necessity, physical hardship, cultural creativity, and historical moment. He lived at the edge of a continent in the process of being transformed that was genuine and difficult, creating a culture that was real and distinctive, and leaving behind a legacy shaped American self-understanding in ways that neither he nor anyone else could have anticipated. Chapter 8: Legacy and Truths. What the cowboy left behind, then a century after the last great calf con. Wild drives rolled north along the Chisholm Trail. Cowboy remains one of the most powerful and widely recognized symbols of American culture. His image has traveled to every corner of the world, adopted and adapted by cultures far removed from the Texas plains, transformed into advertising iconography, political metaphor, cinematic archetype, and fashion statement. Understanding this legacy, what it represents, where it came from, and how it relates to the historical reality is the final dimension of the cowboy story. The cultural power of the cowboy image rests on a set of values that the cowboy came to represent, regardless of historical accuracy. Self-reliance, the ability to manage one's own needs, and solve one's own problems without dependence on others. Physical courage, the willingness to face danger without flinching. Honesty, the binding quality of a man's word in the absence of formal documentation. Loyalty, the commitment to companions, and the outfit that went beyond mere contractual obligation. Lacidine. Simplicity, the preference for direct action over complex negotiation, for plain speech over elaborate persuasion. These values, which were genuinely present in cowboy culture, though in more complicated and less consistent forms than the mythic acknowledges. Became in the popular imagination a kind of ideal American character. The problem with this idealization is not that these values are bad, they are genuinely admirable. And the degree which they historically is problem is historically real. The problem is what the idealization leaves out. The cowboy myth has tended to erase the racial diversity of the actual range. The black boys, the Mexican vaqueros, the Native American workers who were part of the cattle industry from its beginnings. It has tended to erase the economic exploitation that characterized most cowboys' working lives. The low wages, the dangerous conditions, the absence of security, a recourse. It romanticizes a period that was, for the people living through it, characterized as much by monotony, hardship, and uncertainty as by any kind of or heroism. The Western landscape itself, the vast, dramatic spaces of the American West, has been part of the cowboy myth from the beginning. The open sky, the sweeping grasslands, dramatic light of the plains have served as backdrop and character both in the myth and in the reality. The landscape shaped the cowboy's sensibility. His sense of space and distance, his relationship to weather and season, his understanding of the scale of the natural world. This aspect of the cowboy experience, the intense and intimate knowledge of a particular landscape, is one that the myth captures, however imperfectly. And it is one of the reasons that the cowboy story continues to resonate with people who have never been near a cattle ranch. The cowboy's influence on American language, pervasive and largely unrecognized. Hundreds of common English expressions derive from the vocabulary of cattle ranching and trail driving. To rope someone in, to bring them into a plan or enterprise, comes from cattle roping. To be in the limelight has nothing to do with cattle. To have someone pegged is a roping term referring to the act of securing an animal. To ride roughshod comes from horsemanship, to bite the dust, to be under the weather, to pull through, to come a cropper. These and dozens of other common expressions trace their origins to the working world of horses, cattle, and the open range. The clothing styles associated with the cowboy, similarly diffused throughout global culture. The Stetson hat became a symbol of American identity recognized around the world. Western boots became a fashion statement far removed from their functional origins. Denim jeans, originally developed by Levi Strauss, Jacob Davis, as durable working clothes for California gold miners and later adopted by cowboys, became the defining garment of casual American dress and spread from there to clothe the world. The particular combination of function, durability, and style characterized cowboy dress captured something that resonated far beyond the working West. The music that cowboys created on the trail work songs, ballads, laments, and dance music flowed into the broader stream of American folk music, and from there into country music, which became one of the most commercially successful musical genres of the 20th century. The themes that defined cowboy music: loss, longing, the road, the distance between where you are and where you want to be, the relationship between human life and the natural world, turned out to be universal human themes, accessible to people who had never seen a longhorn steer. The political and cultural twist to which the cowboy image has been put throughout American history deserve honest acknowledgement. Politicians from Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush have cultivated cowboy imagery as a form of political communication, associating themselves with the values toughness, directness, independence that the cowboy represents in the popular imagination. This use of the cowboy as political symbol is not necessarily dishonest. The values being invoked are real, but it does simplify a complex historical reality into a usable icon, and it tends to reinforce the myth at the expense of the history. The irony of the cowboy's cultural legacy is the freedom he represents was always constrained. The working cowboy was an employee, not a free agent. He worked for wages under the direction of employers who had power to hire and fire him. He lived on land he did not own, drove cattle he did not own, used horses he did not own. The freedom of the open range was real in the sense of physical space and the absence of urban constraint. It was not freedom in any economic or social sense. The cowboy was, in important ways, one of the most economically vulnerable workers in American history. Unprotected by unions, without benefits or security, entirely at the mercy of market forces, and yet something genuine was there. The physical reality of riding across hundreds of miles open country, of sleeping under the enormous western sky, of working with animals and horses, and one's own body, rather than machines and bureaucracies and the abstract systems of industrial society. This was a form of human experience that carried real meaning for the men who lived it. And that meaning could not be entirely erased. Economic analysis. The cowboy who looked back on his years on the trail in Olge, even in poverty, even in the reduced circumstances of a man whose skills had been rendered obsolete by a changing economy, often remembered those years as the best of his life. The dust and the danger and the monotony were real, but so was something else. A sense of competence, of belonging to a particular place and practice, of mattering in a way that was direct and physical and unambiguous. The story of the American cowboy is ultimately a human story. A story of men doing difficult work in a particular historical moment, creating a culture in response to the demands of their lives, leaving behind a legacy they could not have foreseen and has both honored and distorted what they actually were. The myth they inspired has been powerful enough to shape American national identity and travel the world as an image of something quintessentially American. Something about openness, independence, directness, and the romance of a life lived close to the natural world. The reality that underlies the myth is more complicated, more diverse, more economically constrained, and in many ways more interesting than the myth itself. To know both the myth and the reality, the legend and the man, is understand something important about the history of a nation and the complex relationship between how people actually live and how they choose to remember what they were. In the end, the cowboy, not because the myth is true, but because it speaks to something true, a longing for spaciousness, for competence, for the simplicity of a life organized around clear purpose and physical reality. Whether that longing is itself a myth, whether the open range was ever really as free as it seemed, whether cowboy's life was ever really as meaningful as nostalgia makes it, is a question that each generation must answer for itself. What is certain is that the men who rode the great trails, who drove the longhorns north across hundreds of miles open country, who slept on the ground and ate from the chuck wagon and sang to the cattle under the enormous western sky, their hardships were real. Their culture was real, and the world they made for the brief decades of its existence was unlike anything that come before it or would come after.